My specialty is precision nutrient management, but most of my time is spent in the wheat, corn, canola, sorghum, soybean, so the cropping realm. I do have a few questions on the forage systems, and I spent a lot of my basic fertility work in the forage. So this is kind of a transition of what does it mean in the forage system. Let's see if I can get, there we go. So, today's goals is, things to think about as forage managers, maybe a starting point, because every system is going to have their own starting point. And as we go on, remember the precision is relative. I may start out talking about the basics, and that's the first step that you might need to go to, or you may be past that by decades. So everything's relative, and we're going to be moving through. And I guess a lot of what we're going to be dealing with in the systems is a lot of our nutrient management, NPK, have always been handled with a big stick, and on a forage system it's kind of big and a little stick. Frankenstein, as you was, or Jekyll and Hyde. It's either you go after it with everything, or you really limit it because you just don't want to put a whole lot of inputs in your forage system. So we'll go back as we go through everything. Think about the management style that you're in, or working with, or dealing with, and what's that next step to improve. I say precision is relative, and I'll go back to these pictures. The forage system itself is such a diverse system. There's very little like it, even in a winter wheat. Yeah, we have a lot of environments in the winter wheat, and we can graze winter wheat, but the grain-only style. And then corn, it's very, it's about corn. It's water, the nutrients, the hybrids, and it's done. On a forage, you have fall, spring, summers. You have, the dual purpose. Are you grazing? How are you harvesting? Is it harvest via animal? Is it mechanical? Are you using, 40-year-old equipment, or are you running self-propelled under irrigation? And so depending on you, your system, who you're advising, who you're helping, and even part of the state you're in or the region you're in, the level of precision is completely different. The guy in the old tractor windrowing versus somebody that has self-propelled with auto steer and all the guidance, for each system to move up means a little bit different. You have cattle, and where does that play in? So always remember, precision's relative. It's the goals we have to in mind. But 1-2 part. So, and this is the ultimate goal. If you want to get in precision, or PA, precision ag, however you want to state it, the ultimate goal of any and all precision nutrient management tools should be this: producing the highest quality output with the least amount of input. So in the end, you are optimizing the efficiency, so you're wanting to get the very most out of everything you buy and you put into the system, and get the most out of that system, which maximizing profits. So maximizing efficiency of inputs, maximizing the level of outputs at that. And so the two of those are maximizing profits, which right now and typically is in every person's mind, is how do we make the most out of every dollar? I don't know about you, but it's one of those where the most common question I get is, how am I going to make it with these times? I've been doing talks on forage production, basically titled, how do you grow forage on limited input, or, the most out of your inputs. It's always a comment in the forage system. However, I think in some of these forage systems that I'm around, we can get the biggest bang out of upping some of our input. And I think they're the most neglected, so therefore they may be the most responsive in some of them. The basis. So when it comes to nutrient management, and remember, I'm not talking about auto steer when it comes to precision ag. We're not going to talk about all the other stuff. This is precision nutrient management. The soil sample is the fundamental ground layer for all things we do in nutrient management. Without it, it is really a guess. In Oklahoma, at least, forage systems are extremely underrepresented in the soil testing. if you break out our commodities and see where the soil testing is done, forage does not rank up at the highest. And it's unfortunate because I truly believe that it's in our forage systems that will benefit the greatest and have the greatest economic return from a $10 soil sample. And I remind folks, when you apply fertilizer without a recent soil sample, and recent being anywhere in the last 3 to 5 years, it is nothing more than a guess. It is nothing more than a guess. And to argue with me on that, it's a rough argument that I can probably win every time. It's application with a guess. And there are very few decisions that are made by a farmer ranch on pure guess. A lot of it may be intuition. It may have knowledge. When do you sell? You watch the prices. What do you do? Genetics. You pay close attention. You have a lot of data on choosing the genetics that are going on to your operation. But when it comes to fertilization, it's just, this is what we do. And it's beyond that. So there's a lot of opportunity in the forage system to make more money, be more profitable by adjusting our management strategies. And honestly, I talk about relative. I know enough producers in Oklahoma where a single soil sample for a large field will increase their precision and would be considered precision management for them because they pulled a soil sample. So that's what I mean by relative. They're at least adding a data layer. But as we remember, this is precision. So let's go beyond precision and let's go beyond the composite. A composite sample is just the beginning. Fields are variable. If we look at a composite sample in true meaning should consist of 15 cores, 15 subsamples put into a bucket, mixed up exceptionally well, then submitted to the lab. It's a composite is an average. To get to the average, or an average is no more than a range summed together and divided by the total number of entries, subsamples, or otherwise. So we are looking at an average of the field. Anybody that has been on any forage field across the southern Great Plains, unless it's in some of the irrigated western areas, understands we have variability within our forage systems. We may have 2 soil types. We may have 12 soil types. We have low areas, bad areas, good areas. We have a significant amount of variability. Some of the recent data I'm gaining is looking at grid sample fields. So these numbers you see in this corner. What I've done is I've requested grid soil sample data from producers. And by the way, if you guys have grid soil sample data and want to send it to me, I welcome it. It will build to my data set, and I'm doing some really cool things. Back to the point. This is a summary of 189 fields from Kansas to Oklahoma. So we have 20 or 30 in Kansas and about 150 from Oklahoma, basically going from, we have a few south of I-40, but majority are in the northern part of the state. A lot of it's wheat, some alfalfa, some Bermuda grass forage systems. I wanted to look at and describe the variability of the southern Great Plains and how variable are soil. So I requested a soil sample, and the 189 are all fields which we at least have 5 samples from. Now, these results come from every lab, A&L, Ward, OSU, Kansas, Texas, Servitec, all labs, and all types of phosphorus and pH. And I've done the correlations to bring them together. The things that are amazing to me is if you look at the average, our average pH is really good. It's a 6.12. But a range, that range is the average pH from top to bottom in any given field. So the range in our average pH is 1.7. That would mean the average field goes from a 5.2 to a 7 on average. That's a significant range if you think about it. What's even more, surprising, or not surprising, but more telling, is that about 28 to 29% of all samples of all fields that came into the system, this includes Bermuda grass, wheat, and otherwise, had a range greater than 3 pH units. 3 units. So that more than a quarter of all the fields had a range of more than 3 pH units, which means if the average was a 6, the field goes from a 4.5 to a 7.5. That's a significant range and has a significant impact, especially on forage production. What producers tend to forget is pH drives biomass more than about anything else. So if your pH is off, you lose biomass. And if your end game is biomass, you're shooting yourself in the foot if you have anything below a 5.5, hardly regardless of what you're trying to grow. The phosphorus had an average of 28 ppm. Critical level for Oklahoma, Kansas runs around 30 to 32. At a 28, I'm probably not making much of a recommendation for a wheat or a forage system. But our range, the average range per field was 52 units. That meant the average field went from 2 to 52. So non-existent to well above sufficiency, or losing 70 to 80% of your forage production to not needing to drop a phosphorus for the next 5 to 10 years. K, same thing. K was well above our sufficiency of 125, but it shows we have a massive range. Our range is nearly the size of our average. On the phosphorus, our range is almost twice the average. Sulfur, we have significant range in sulfur, and even organic matter. An average organic matter of 2, but that's plus or minus 1.2%. Now, on the organic matter and sulfur, we didn't have all the fields. There's only about 100 fields in those. But we have all 189 fields in the pH, P, and K realm. Now, as we get into sampling, so this is I just want to explain the variability, and we have a lot of variability, and most would they see this and the numbers are a little shocking, but it's not too great of a surprise. Before we get much into anything else, you need to understand, I'm going to get into the zone, I'm going to get into grid management and the hybrid. What do I mean by these things? So a zone management, as you see on the left-hand side, is you are treating fields separately. So in this case, you separated the field into 1, 2, 3, 4 areas, 1 based off of waterway, 2 an old fence line. So you're going 1 and 2, and then an old fence line and a hillside. In a zone management, you're basically going from 1 field to multiple small fields, but you're treating as a composite. So this sample 1, everything in this area will receive the same NPK, pH, and etc. The same as sample 2 over here, the same as sample 3 and sample 4. So you are really looking at these regions are treated as an independent field. A grid, the difference in a grid is that every point you take and every sample you take is taken independently. So in the zone, you have this samples combined with this, this, and this. Over here, 59 is independent. This is actually 59, this is a value. So this would be sample 1 and sample 2. This value is independent. So the difference in the zone, you create 4 smaller fields. In a grid, you have a independent layer for every nutrient. You aren't averaging points across. You're looking at a single point representing that. And so in a zone, NPK is applied at 1 right here, NPK is applied at another right here, other right here, other right here. On a grid, each layer is independent, so you don't have the consistency of their larger fields. And there's lots of techniques which hybridize the zone by grid approach. I have to remind, regardless of the samples, and so K-State has done some great work. Lucas Haig has done some really phenomenal work out in western Kansas on the impact of soil sampling economically. But regardless of whether you sample zone or grid or even composite, it is just like yield monitor data or any other kind of data. Bad data in gives bad results. It is about good data, and good data with soil samples comes from the number of samples you take per sample, the number of cores you pull per sample. And this graph over here just shows that if you only have 1, 2 to even 5 samples pulled from a field, a composite, or even a grid area, you're allowing a massive amount of error to come into the value that you output. And it effectively takes 15 points in a field, or 15 points in a zone, or 15 points in a grid to get a good representation average, a good average concept of what that field looks like. Zone management. So this is that next step from a composite. I like zones as the next step. I'm going to dog on them a lot, but I want you to understand I do like zones, especially in Forage, because it's that legitimate first step. I like any concept which increases the resolution that we're working at, or which makes our fields smaller. So zone management. The first question is, how do I draw lines? And that's honestly the most challenging question. I came up with a list not too long ago that I could use about 40 to 50 different characteristics to draw lines in a field to make zones, and all of them created a different zone. Your top corner here, this is land classification, class 1, class 2. I've seen people do that. Soil types are a very easy go-to. Slope, the bottom versus the side slope versus the top. Old yield, if you're in a grain system, you can do yield. This is EC data, so textural data. There's all kinds of different ways to drive zones and the lines at which you're going to sample within. I would put it towards you this way. Don't go into precision ag saying, what can it do for me? I don't know. I'm just going to start randomly collecting data or applying stuff. You will be disappointed 80% of the time. Go into precision ag with a goal. I want to blank. I want to improve my nitrogen management. I want to improve my phosphorus management. I want to improve my soil pH. Have a goal in mind. Once you know in your goal, I'll relate this back. Your goal should be what you perceive as your greatest challenge in that field, in that farm, in that system. Fix that biggest challenge first, or the one that may have the biggest economic impact. Because you get in here and you draw so many lines. Do it to what makes sense to you for that system. And guess what? If you're using zone management, you are very likely going to change your lines over time. Let's say you believe soil pH is your biggest factor. Then you might sample based on texture or land soil types. You work on pH. You get pH fixed. Now you need to redraw your lines to look at, maybe it's phosphorus, maybe it's stand, something like that, and re-look at how you need to manage that. And a zone should not be stagnant, but it should be a target for what you're working on, and then you change that target over time as you reach your new goals. Why does it matter how to draw lines? Don't assume zone management is the end game. Zone management is a way to make one large field into 2 to 4 smaller fields. We still said, though, it is still a composite across the field. It's just a smaller field, so you still have potential error. What we find is that very seldom do the things we're trying to manage line up. pH, phosphorus, P, K, magnesium, calcium, sulfur don't match up perfectly. Your zones, if you're going after phosphorus, and you drew a map based upon a grid, and you'll see this later, your phosphorus map will not look like a potassium map, will not look like a pH map, will not look like a buffer index. They are unrelated variables in the soil. So that's why you go after what you think is your biggest target. That should probably be based off of a composite. If I go back up here, if I have a soil pH of field that's 7, pH isn't what I'm thinking about. But if I have a soil pH that comes around 5.5 to a 6, there's a high likelihood that there's enough pH variability in the field where a zone or a grit is going to pay. Phosphorus, if my phosphorus is at 60 ppm, walk away, I don't care. But if it's at 20 to 28, with the ranges that I know could be potentially happening, there is a big benefit there. Inversely, if your composite pH is a 4, your composite phosphorus is a 2, that just means lime the whole freaking field. Put phosphorus on the whole field. Don't worry about variability because you're so far in the tank, you got to bring it up to closer to average before any kind of PA, precision ag, provides any kind of benefit for you. This is some data. I like looking at this. This provides opportunity, and I can show this same slide set for about 250 to 300 fields. This is elevation of phosphorus. If we used elevation, this has a fair amount of elevation change on this field. This is real field, this is real data. If we used elevation to determine phosphorus, we would be wrong. Phosphorus does not follow elevation. It's thinking my computer doesn't like me today. If we use phosphorus to drive potassium, we're wrong. K's low, phosphorus isn't really low. The two are not related. There's some tendencies to be similar, but they're not, and you wouldn't miss if you wanted to work off of, if you wanted to fix your K, you cannot work off a phosphorus map, and both of them would have been completely missed for an elevation map. Okay, my computer's going not liking me today. Let's see if I go back up one. Okay, down. All right, we'll just go here. This is some data that I stole from Chad Gutsy, who's out in Ray, Colorado now as a private consultant, but I still like to steal his stuff because he did it while he's in Oklahoma. We look at the influence of soil type on crop yield. In this case, you see this is some soybean yields. There's something going on here. The soil type's going across. We definitely have some higher yields in this soil type. So soil type can be a very good estimator if that's the driving factor. If you go from a sand to a clay, it's very likely going to be a big drive. However, we can easily, in the Southern Great Plains, have 5 types of silt loams in a field, have 5 soil types that all be in a silt loam. And that may or may not influence the crop yield. So you got to look at, what kind of differences do I have? Where's that play into? In some cases, the soil map doesn't tell us much. You look at this field has a significant range in actually yield, and you look at it, it's all on soil type. So in this case, soil type does nothing to help us separate out what's going on in this field. We looked at this, and in this field, we really examined it, sampled the tar out of it, and it turned out that for this field right here, yield, the biggest determining factor for yield in this field was depth delimiting layer, where it drove 45 to 46% of the variability in yield was explained by the depth of the limiting layer. The shallower that redoxamorphic or the basically high water table, the lower the soybean yields. And the high yields were outliers detailed, and we can talk about it a little bit more. Let's go down. All right. The field had 4 years of no-till. Soils were a silt loam, a clay loam, and a silt loam. This is another field we're looking at. We had data collected in the spring and the fall, grid samples analyzed for everything. EC was collected, so we have EC. Soil cores were evaluated to determine depth delimiting layer. And yield monitor averaged over the field with 60-foot radius. We look at the pH. The pH ranged from a 5 to a 7.5, but it really didn't drive the yield. We look at phosphorus versus yield, and yeah, there's a correlation there, and it does go up as you go up with soil test. It's going to be fairly weak. Why? They fertilized with phosphorus with the units, so a little bit of correlation, but that doesn't explain everything. We're talking about a 10 to a 50 bushel yield difference, and that slope's kind of weak to explain all of it. We looked at all kinds of things, looked at the micronutrients, looked at the EC, looked at all that stuff, and the answer comes out to, if you combined everything in some kind of predicted, so this is a feature that Dr. Godsey made to use all those parameters thrown in together, gave us our ultimate best correlation. So this goes back in, I like zones as the first step, but we have to acknowledge that we're missing a lot of the underlying variation. So to get to the answer to that variation, you have to look at everything independently and put it all together to really drive some of those decision aid tools and see how much all those things together are driving yield, because everything in agriculture is completely and absolutely interactive and interconnected and working off of each other into that system. Grid sample. The very, very, very few forage producers, unless they're under the irrigated silage, or alfalfa. Really think that the grid samples are something they could do, primarily because of price, because you're looking at something anywhere between $6 to $14 an acre, and that's really tough. Not only do you get that cost goes, a composite sample is going to cost you $10 over an 80-acre field, but a grid is going to cost you $8 an acre over an 80-acre field. That's a significant difference. The experts, I've listened to argument after argument about grid versus zone versus the ability of grid, and one expert will say that grids are not of any value because we are not sampling at high enough resolution to to accurately explain the variation. Because basically, if you go into any soil, phosphorus can change dramatically within 50 feet. It's been proven. 50 feet is all it takes to change phosphorus dramatically. And we aren't sampling at that. Our resolutions are anywhere between a 1 and a 13-acre resolution. And so that argument's valid, that we are not sampling at a resolution which accurately describes the variation. I would argue on the other side of that, though, anything that you do, we may not completely describe the variation of the field, but you are doing a better job than a composite. And some will say that even the grid provides a better average. I think it provides an opportunity to see trends, to look at areas and utilize those. The resolution, I like a 2.5-acre grid. I'll just be honest. I think that provides an answer. Most forage systems look at a 5 to 10. I will tell you, in eastern Oklahoma, from I-40 up into Bonita, there has been some phenomenal returns, ROI, return on investment, for grid sampling fields, because those fields were Bermuda grass fields. Those fields had a composite pH of 5.8, 5.9. Those fields had a composite phosphorus of 25 and composite potassiums in the low areas. Those fields, by doing that grid, were significantly able to reduce the amount of lime needed to bring that up. They saw winter kill go down. They saw survivability to go up. I truly think for the southern Great Plains that grid sampling can be paid for 95% of the time on a pH basis. If you do variable rate lime, it can pay for a grid. The half side of that is we got to have technology within the area to do variable rate lime. Now, more of the grain belt is bringing that in. Unfortunately, a lot of the phosphorus, a lot of the forage territory does not have a lot of that availability. There are things you can do. I call them poor man's VRT. We can do things with old machines and still do a decent job of VRT and improve what we're doing. But the resolution for me is something, if you're ready to go there, do it at whatever you're comfortable with that field that lies most on this average to sub-average level. That field that you look at a composite and think, I may want to do lime, but it just doesn't work out. It's not low enough for me to bother with it. It makes me think about it. Same thing with phosphorus. If it's that, I may or may not. Those are the fields that have the greatest potential to pay off, because that average that's right on the line means there's 50% of the field that's below it and 50% of the field that's above it. So those are the fields that you really reduce total application and get the biggest return on investment. Let's see. There's one aspect that I think is important to remember for precision ag. Most precision ag techniques, and this, I think, the concept has really started coming across and getting to be a little bit better understood. But precision ag or precision nutrient management will not give you a uniform field the majority of the time. The goal of precision ag is actually to help push the production in the good regions, identify those areas of the field that are highly producing, that could probably even be producing better if inputs are applied. And those regions of the field which are just junk, helps you identify those and start drawing back on your inputs. And so you don't have to apply as much there. You don't have to sink that much money in that field. So you limit the loss. In the end, that actually means on your low producing fields, you may produce the same or a little bit less just because it's not economical to produce there. And on the good part of the field, you produce even more. So your variability in yield and production may even increase as you go into precision ag technologies. In all precision ag, precision nutrient management, you've got to remember the basics. And remember that any properly sold sample is good. So if you aren't done composite, that's the first step in precision ag. The next step is zone management. The next step is into grid management. Then you get into sensor management and on the go and things like that. Doing something is better than doing nothing. And I'll put it on the ladder again. These are your targets of what you want to get after and where you go. Soil pH is going to have the biggest impact overall on your production, on your forage quality, on your forage amount, and on your grazing or hay. Fix it first. That is where your money in a precision ag technology can be paid. If your pH is good, your next step process is P and K. Then it falls into the nitrogen, sulfur, and some of your secondaries and micros. And then you start doing the multi-nutrient variable application where I don't see that paying off in the forage systems where you go variable rate P, variable rate K, variable rate S, unless you're on the highly productive irrigated ground that you have to do a lot of replacement and that. So Central Great Plains, dry land, forage, pasture, hay meadow, what bit, you're looking at pH, guys. You're looking at P and K secondary and then on effect. In this economic time, do something. It's better than nothing. Knowing something, collecting any piece of data off of that piece of ground will help you make a better decision, will help you make a more informed decision and a more economic decision. I'll throw this out there. I've talked about this. You guys heard this. Well, you may not have, but I've talked about this ad nausea. Most of what I've talked about on this has been in the wheat system. This works well in any forage system, and this is a nitrogen-rich strip. I'm also saying that if you have any questions about phosphorus or K management, go get some from the local co-op. I currently I'm sending them out to our educators. If you have any questions, I am buying for our OSU educators a push spreader from actually Amazon. You can get them from the local hardware store that will throw out a 10-foot spread. If you want to improve your forage system, regardless of what forage system you are, and do it on the cheap, buy a $50 push spreader, go get a bag of urea, get a bag of phosphorus and a bag of potassium, and do those strips. When you see a response, you know that field will respond from those nutrients, apply more. If you don't see a response, back off. It gives you an opportunity to make some informed decisions based upon the plant needs in that field, in that environment, in that season, and it can really make some big benefit. Just seeing these strips right here can allow and can help adjust and make in-season decisions that can impact a wheat grazer by $10 to $15 per acre just by knowing it's time to fertilize. And folks, you that graze or work in grazing systems have these already. When you see a cowpox, when you see that yellow patch, that green patch out in the middle of the pasture, that is an immediate decision aid tool that says, I need to fertilize now. I'm losing forage production. I'm losing gain. I'm losing that conversion from biomass to beef. It's a little bit on the brief side, about 35, 40 minutes into. I have all my contact information. There's actually a write-up on my blog that is basically what we just covered right now, osunpk.com. You can go there to read a little bit more in depth, see kind of some of the discussion I had about this. Of course, follow me on any of the social media, Facebook, Twitter, and check out some of our other websites.